non-diclofenac.
No. Where? They can't be far away because we're hearing them banging in the pipes. They're probably one floor above. Fifth floor?
Oh, God, I hate the dentist.
Welcome to fall, everyone. It's finally fall, and welcome once again to Free Associations for the Boston University School of Public Health, the Public Health and Medical Journal Club podcast. For anyone who is as confused by the latest health study as I am when I try to get those automatic faucets in the airport to recognize that I exist, do you guys have this trouble that I have?
I know it. Have you ever seen the third season of Fargo?
I haven't seen Fargo.
Oh, it's really great.
I heard it's great.
It's really great, but the protagonist has that same phenomenon of like
they don't recognize I exist.
They don't recognize
anywhere.
that she exists, and she feels like that in her professional and personal life as well.
I take it personally.
Yeah,
I do.
That's funny because the same thing happens to me, but only with the towels.
The towels?
Yeah,
they won't dispense.
Yeah, the faucets dispense fine.
The automatic dispenser of towels don't.
For some reason,
it has something to do with vampirism. October 31st is coming up. We'll have to find out what happens to Don.
We will. We definitely will. Anyway, I'm Matt Fox from the Departments of Epidemiology and Global Health here at the BU School of Public Health, and I am in the studio as always, with Chris Gill and Don Thea.
Only from the Department of Global Health.
Only from the Department of Global Health. And as always, we are here in the Boston University Godley studio. So as I mentioned, it is now fall. The weather is changing. Things are getting colder. It's that time of year when you want to make a fire and curl up with a good book. I don't know about you guys. I rather curl up with a good website. I like to curl up with the Population Health Exchange website. I don't know if you guys have been to this, but it's
never heard of it.
It's one of those really good fall websites that you want to go to and have a look around.
It's like pumpkin spice latte of public health.
It's the pumpkin spice latte of public health, and you can go there and you can find all kinds of public health tools and videos and courses and things. I think you're really going to like it. It's at www.pophealthex.org. And again, you can find this podcast here as well as many other population health learning programs and tools. We do want to take a second to remind you to go ahead and give us a rating on iTunes or Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or whatever you guys are using. It really does help people find us. And I just want to remind people, to give us a rating, you really just have to hit that button that says 5 stars or whatever you want to give us. You don't have to go onto a website or anything. And if you do want to go on the website, though, and give us an actual review, we would love that as well. It helps people find the podcast.
Good reviews or scoldings.
Whatever people want to give us, that's fine. And also good news. Apparently, I noticed that if you actually search for Free Associations podcast now, we now come up above the Toronto Raptors podcast. So I'm really thrilled.
Raptors
the
or
Toronto
rappers?
Raptors.
It's a group that's fond of Hawks.
It's
and
not.
Eagles.
It's a basketball team.
Oh, what?
Kawhi Leonard.
They play basketball there?
Yeah, they do. Anyway, that is the perfect time to say now. Onto the show.
I thought they only played hockey.
Oh, boy.
Well, they wear hockey skates while they play basketball, apparently.
Oh, that's a trick.
Today in our first segment, which is our Journal Club segment, we are going to look at a study that looked at a very common non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, or otherwise known as NSAIDs, and cardiovascular risk. Then in the second part of the podcast, which is our deep dive, we're going to look at a study in Nature and Human Behavior that looked at whether studies published in the journal Nature and Science, particularly psychological studies, were able to be replicated. And then in our third segment, which is our Amazing and Amusing segment, we'll get into some things that have made us laugh out loud, or Chris will help us with our group work strategies and figure out what the best approach is. So let's get into it. In segment 1, as I said, we're going to get into an article that looks at the effect of, and now I got to remember how we all agreed to pronounce this, diclofenac?
Diclofenac. We
will pronounce it many different ways on this episode. I hadn't heard of this drug, but you guys have.
Otherwise known as Voltaren in the U.S.
Voltaren sounds like Voltar. Sounds like a video game.
Something Spock would take.
Sounds like the thing that made Tom Hanks go back to his childhood in the movie Big.
Mm-hmm. Or maybe one of those energy-efficient cars.
Whatever it is. Anyway, we're going to look at the effects of diclofenac on cardiovascular risk. The study was published in the British Medical Journal, known to you out there as the BMJ. The first author was Morten Schmidt of the Department of Clinical Epidemiology at Aarhus University in Denmark. The study was titled Diclofenac Use and Cardiovascular Risk, Series of Nationwide Cohort Studies. I do need to say that this one, we didn't choose this one because it came out in the headlines. We specifically chose this one because it was actually sent to us by the first author and asked us if we would be interested in reviewing it and ripping it apart, I think was what he said. No, he didn't say that exactly, but he said to have at it or something like that. And so we thought it was of interest and we thought we would go for it. Full disclosure, I do want to point out that the folks at Aarhus University do have a relationship with us here at Boston University, and some of these authors are actually affiliated with our department in a adjunct or secondary capacity. But I think, as we have proven before, we can rip apart our own studies. We can rip apart anybody's studies. So, Don, let me start with you. Can you describe the study? Tell us what it was all about.
Sure, Matt. One of the interesting things, and just sort of glancing through this, that caught my eye was that the subtitle of the title that you just mentioned, which states a series of nationwide cohort studies, and they underscore the fact that this is 252 or 57 cohort studies, and that really caught my eye because that's a pretty big series of studies. But as we get into it, and as I describe the methodology, which I thought was really interesting and quite unique, it becomes a little bit more clear. So the backstory on this particular medication is that after the problem with Vioxx, which was another non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, was discovered and it was withdrawn from the market, because of the idea that there are adverse side effects to this family of drugs is something that needs to be looked at kind of in a systematic way. And the problem with Vioxx was that it tended to produce thromboembolic events, or blood clots were being thrown off at a quite high degree. And oftentimes these adverse events, though very, very worrisome, can be not so common as to be able to be identified as a problem during the clinical trial. And these are aftermarket events that really become a problem. So this particular NSAID, diclofenac, is something that inhibits in the process of its mechanism of action, which is to decrease inflammation and be a painkiller. It also can have some side effects in terms of gastric upset or gastric bleeding. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. So EMA, which is the European equivalent of the FDA, called for an evaluation of the safety of this particular drug because it's one of the most common NSAIDs used throughout the world. So these authors had access to a really unique set of data sets that they put together in a really unique way that was able to address this issue without doing a long-term prospective randomized trial, which really wouldn't be ethical at this point since there is a question raised about this particular adverse event. So the way they approached it was that they accessed 3 large data sets in Denmark. And Denmark is one of the few places where you can do this because they've got universal health care and everybody, it's free for everybody to go to the doctor, and they've got a very, very extensive pharmacy record system. So they basically put together a series of data sets that went all the way back to 1997, where they could match up individuals and match up prescriptions and match up visits to a healthcare center.
Yeah, they've got the Danish got amazing data.
Yeah, so there was the Danish National Patient Registry, which is all Danish hospitals and healthcare places, Danish National Prescription Registry, and the Danish Civil Records. So the way they approached this was to, from this very rich data set, extract a series of short, retrospectively collected data, but looking prospectively. So, for instance, in 1997, what they did was they looked at all of those individuals who had not filled a prescription for an NSAID for the prior 12 months, which they called the washout period, meaning that these individuals were not exposed to the drug of choice. And then they counted the number of individuals who filled a prescription for 2 other NSAIDs, naproxen and ibuprofen, as well as diclofenac, in that month. And then they followed them for, 30 days? 30 days, looking for cardiovascular events. And then they did that every month from 1997 until 2007, I think it was.
That sounds right. I'll look it up while you're talking.
And they counted the number of exposures and the number of events that occurred during each one of those 30-day periods. So in essence, it's 7 years or 10 years worth of 32-month observation periods. And so there were some individuals who were in the trial more than once. The inclusion criteria were that you had to be over 18 years of age with a 1 year of continuous prescription records prior to the study start date so they could establish whether the wash period was there. And that if you had, they said one of the exclusion criteria was that if you had previous cardiovascular disease, you were excluded, but they did a subsequent analysis where they actually looked at those. If you had heart failure, stroke, or any of those other cardiovascular events, chronic kidney disease, liver disease, use of digoxin, which is a medicine for congestive heart failure, alcoholism, and a bunch of other things. So there were 3 comparator groups consisting of active NSAID use or non-users or active non-NSAID users, which is the paracetamol or Tylenol use. So there are 3 groups that they compared with the people that were enrolled using diclofenac. This particular setup, I had not known this term, and I had not known this kind of methodology, but it's called an emulator trial. And Matt, maybe you can describe a little bit about that later on.
Yep.
If there were dual enrollments, they had to be more than 1 year apart, so that if they enrolled me on January 1997, I couldn't be enrolled, even though they only observed me till March, say, of that year. I could only be re-enrolled 1 year later because I had to have that, and I had to have that washout period subsequently. As I said, the endpoints are major adverse cardiovascular events, and their approach to the analysis was a Cox proportional hazard, and they said intention to treat. But I think one of the strengths about this is that these were prescriptions not written, but prescriptions filled, and it's a little bit closer to reality because people could fill the prescription and not take the pill, but the presumption is that they did. They did subgroup analyses based on baseline risk, which they defined as having diabetes or having a prior cardiovascular event. And again, before I said that portion was excluded initially, but in a subsequent sub-analysis, they did, in fact, do a comparison between the group that had no risk, baseline risk, and the groups that had.
In other words, the effect of diclofenac compared to these other things among those with diabetes and then among those without.
And or those with a high baseline risk would be that prior history of stroke or cardiovascular event.
Got it.
And then they did a whole bunch of sensitivity analyses, which I don't think we need to go in depth, but they did a lot of sort of scenario analyses of including and excluding various different populations. So they had about 1.37 million initiators of diclofenac, 291,000 naproxen, 3.8 million people took Tylenol, 700 and 1.3 million people were non-initiators. So they really were sort of the baseline control group. And the major results was that there was an increase in the adverse event rate for initiators of diclofenac, a 50% increase over those who were non-initiators. There's sort of the purest control group. There was likewise a 20% increase in the existence of adverse events in comparison to people that were taking Tylenol or ibuprofen, and a 30% increase for people that were, in comparison to people that were taking naproxen. There was also a 2.5-fold increase in upper GI bleed within the 30 days, which is a non-cardiovascular event, but obviously a very serious event and something that we've known for quite some time is a risk for taking these kinds of medicine. And it rose to a 4.5-fold increase in comparison to those who didn't initiate any kind of these medicines. So the bottom line is that diclofenac increased risk across all baseline groups, meaning age, sex, and those baseline characteristics, and for all outcomes. I didn't go into it, but when they looked at individual cardiovascular events, each one of those individually as well as collectively had an increase of risk within the 30-day period after taking this particular medicine. And the absolute risk was higher with a prior cardiovascular history, but the relative risk, i.e. the amount that it actually increased, was the highest when compared to the people that did not have a prior cardiovascular risk.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm gonna take the whatever prerogative here, and I'm going to go first this time because there's a particular thing that I want to talk about before we get into our critique of the study, which is this idea of emulating a trial that Don mentioned. And I will just say up front that I really like this study. I thought that the there are some flaws that I can point to. There's some things that you'd love to have seen. I don't know, done better isn't the right word, that they just didn't have the data to be able to deal with. But this idea of emulating a trial, I think, is really important. And I think it's a big, maybe advance isn't the right word, but it's just sort of a really impressive clarification in our thinking about observational studies that has come along in the past, 5 to 10 years or so, that I think is really helping observational epidemiology. It's an idea that's, I don't know where it first originated, but it's an idea that the group over at Harvard, Miguel Hernan and colleagues, have really been pushing, and I think it's so right-headed. And the idea is essentially that if we're going to do an observational study, we can, we often get into these situations where we have data, and therefore, because we have data, we can do an analysis. And doing the analysis doesn't actually mean that we've ever defined the study question that we really want to ask. And the idea of a target trial or an emulated trial is, rather than just starting with the data and doing a data analysis, let's start with the study question, and let's define the hypothetical randomized controlled trial that we would do if we could. We're not going to, and we're not arguing that randomized trials are the end-all, be-all, that observational studies are terrible. The observational studies are very important and have a really important role to play. But if we think about the randomized trial that we would do if we could, if there were no ethical limitations and there were no financial limitations, then we can design an observational study that mimics that randomized trial and hopefully avoids a lot of the problems that we get into when we just take data and try to analyze it. So the idea here is that what the authors have done is that they have first designed the randomized trial that they would do, which is you have somebody who comes in with an indication for one of these drugs. You then would randomize them to one of several options. Maybe you randomize them to either diclofenac or naproxen, or what are the other options here? Tylenol or a placebo. Those might be your 4 options. And then they say, okay, so if we were to do this as a randomized trial, we wouldn't just include everybody. We would define who the population is that we think this is relevant to. And we would map that out, and we would have very strict inclusion and exclusion criteria. Then we would define our interventions, we would define our outcomes, and we'd define when follow-up time starts for each person, when randomization would occur, and how long we're going to follow people and what we're going to follow them for. And if we do that in our observational study, it helps us clarify that we are actually answering the question that we think we are. And that's what I think is novel isn't the right word here. They didn't come up with this idea, but it's an application of a what shouldn't be a novel idea, but I think is. I don't think we see this nearly as much as we should. And I think this is going to help us avoid a lot of problems going forward. The other thing is, in a randomized trial, you think about this, we would never start with people who are already exposed to whatever our intervention is, right? We start, I don't mean to imply that you couldn't have had the exposure already. You could have had this study without a washout period, but the intervention starts at the point at which we start the intervention. Whereas in observational studies, we might start when people have already had the exposure for decades, in which case they may have already had the exposure and the outcome and dropped out of the population. All these things that could go wrong when we start with incident exposures are avoided if we think clearly about these emulated trials. So to me, that's a really novel addition to this particular analysis.
Do you think it can be applied in settings where there isn't the richness of the data available on a nationwide basis, excluding almost nobody?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I don't think this applies only to huge data sets, and I don't think this applies only to data sets where you have massive amount of confounder information to go with it. The idea here is not that this approach solves the problem of unmeasured confounding or random error. It solves the idea of what question am I answering, and am I really answering it correctly? You still have to have all that other information. One thing I should have said was we start with the ideal randomized trial, and then we mimic it as best we can. We often can't, right? There are things that are missing here. So one of the critiques you would say about the study is there's no placebo equivalent for those in the non-starting group, those who got nothing. In the randomized trial version, we would have some kind of a placebo to deal with the potential placebo effects, and you don't have that here. Is that a big problem? Probably not, but it's one of the things that's missing, and it's a compromise that you make when you go from the trial version to the observational version. But at least you know that's a potential problem because you emulated the trial.
Yeah, in this situation, the non-initiators didn't come into contact with the healthcare system necessarily because they wanted something. They were seeking relief that an NSAID could provide.
Yep.
So in that way, there is a systematic difference between them. What it means is, I don't know.
Yeah, it's just, there could be this sort of placebo effect that goes on here just from getting a drug. Now, does the placebo effect affect heart attacks?
Not so much.
Probably not. So is it a big deal here? Not. Is it a big deal here? Probably not. I'm just saying, when you think about it, there are compromises that you make, and this is one of them. Chris, what's your take?
I'm reminded of a sharp commentary from The Onion about this, where they reported that a fifth of whiskey reduces the perception of heart attacks.
Yes, it does. I do remember that one.
I thought it was very astute.
And I believe an aspirin a day taken with
whiskey.
With whiskey reduces your I can't remember.
Your memory of a heart
No,
attack.
it was a cheesemburger a day taken with an aspirin reduces your risk of heart attack.
Yeah, it was very, very good. I also really like this study. I'm going to walk it back and try to contextualize this and try to explain to our listeners why the question about diclofenac was I think so important. So if people recall, around 2000, 2002, there was a big kerfuffle in the clinical epidemiology literature about this drug called Vioxx, which was a compound not very dissimilar to diclofenac that was a drug made by Merck. And it was an alternative to ibuprofen within the family of NSAIDs. So ibuprofen is one of the first, I think it actually was the first, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory. And it is what is called a non-selective COX enzyme inhibitor. So COX stands for cyclooxygenase, which is an enzyme that triggers a cascade of inflammatory responses. And there are two flavors of COX1 and COX2. And both of them have anti-inflammatory consequences, but the COX-1 seems to be more related to inhibition of platelet aggregation, which is why aspirin, which is has a power effect on COX-1, leads to increased risk of bleeding. But there is also a change in the function of the stomach lining as a result of COX-1 inhibition, leading to gastric ulcers and gastrointestinal bleeds, and so that was a problem. So this led to the introduction of so-called selective COX-2 inhibitors, which would, in theory, reduce your risk of having a GI bleed if you're taking NSAIDs for chronic osteoarthritis for years and years and years. You're taking them every day, and you want to have a risk of having an intestinal bleed. And so the COX-2 inhibitors were touted as being much safer. But what was not realized is that because this whole COX physiology is so complicated and that there are pro-thrombotic and anti-thrombotic consequences to inhibiting these enzymes, that by shifting the enzyme using the COX-2 drugs, you inadvertently increase the risk of heart attack, even while supposedly decreasing the risk of gastrointestinal side effects. And so there were a lot of politics around that, and there was a lot of mud slung, and there was possibly some corporate conflict of interest stuff going on that sort of delayed the, perception of this, the identification of this risk. But the net result was that Vioxx was irredeemably tarnished and had to be removed from the market. Even after initially getting a black box warning, then it was just off the market entirely. And subsequently, other COX-2 inhibitors have been removed from the U.S. market. And the only one that remains, I think, is Celebrex, and which somehow escaped this, being associated with having in theory, the same consequence. Now, the thing is that all these drugs basically work the same way. So you would think if Vioxx had this side effect, then so would rofecoxib and so would all, Celebrex, and possibly so would diclofenac, which is not technically speaking a COX-2 inhibitor, a selective COX-2 inhibitor. But unlike ibuprofen, which is totally indiscriminate in inhibiting COX-1 and COX-2, diclofenac inhibits COX-2 at a ratio of 20-1 versus COX-1.
Okay.
So it is very similar to Vioxx. And so this raised the question of like, since this one is technically not a COX-2 inhibitor, but is kind of like a backdoor COX-2 inhibitor, should we have the same concerns about it increasing cardiovascular risk as Vioxx did? And what this study is showing is that concern is absolutely on the mark. Assuming that we take the results at face value, that, if this hypothesis that COX-2 inhibition leads to prothrombotic events and therefore cardiovascular risk goes up, these are the kind of results that one would expect to see. And so I found that it comes from a very strong scientific premise that we would think that this probably should be true, and the results are entirely consistent with the truth. And the fact that they use this rather clever methodology, I think, adds further justification. So with that, I will just want to emphasize that, this approach, this emulated trials or the use of propensity scores to match your subjects is very clever, but it does not technically resolve some of the limitations of a observational study. I mean, we still have imperfect measurement, so we have measurement error. But
specifically, what variables are you concerned about? Because I was thinking about this as well. Are you worried that they're underdiagnosing or overdiagnosing heart conditions, or that they're getting the drugs wrong?
Well, no, I was thinking more, that's one possibility, but I was thinking more in terms of the covariates that are going into this model. Those would have to be measured. So like whenever we measure covariates, are you a smoker? People say yes or no. People have different interpretations of what it means to be a smoker.
Yep.
Like, I only smoke a pack a day. I'm not a smoker. I mean, there is that kind of logic that goes on.
Sure.
I only smoke a pack a day on weekends, so I'm not a smoker.
Well, and they wouldn't have even had the smoking information, if that's relevant.
So that is a general limitation. The other thing, of course, is that it does nothing for hidden confounders. So that is
unknown
true.
Or unmeasured, I would say.
But I thought the authors were very upfront about this, and they talk about sort of trying to estimate the degree, the magnitude to which these hypothetical hidden confounders would have to exist in order to significantly defeat the results. And so I thought that was a very powerful sort of counter argument to what they recognize as an inherent limitation in their methodology.
These are the sensitivity analyses Don was referring to. Yep.
I'm not sure that they didn't have access to some of those baseline covariates.
Oh, sorry, am I wrong about that?
Because they had access to the hospitalization records, they had access to the healthcare records. So, they talk about the existence of comorbidities. They don't mention smoking, but it's entirely possible. I mean, we don't know. They don't give us the information, but
I'm going based on table 1 where they don't have any smoking information. They do have.
All I'm saying is that they had access to a lot of health records, and it's entirely possible that that information could have been put in there and would have been verified by the physician or the healthcare worker as opposed to recall.
Right. And all that's true. But, for example, one of the comorbidities they mention is diabetes. But diabetes is not diabetes.
Right.
I mean, there is an endless spectrum of severity of diabetes. And so merely saying yes or no does not necessarily match on
that. They had, in other words, my point here is they had comorbidity data. They had that hospital information. They wouldn't probably have had smoking data because that would be something that would not necessarily be in a medical, with a
it would
in a like an ICD-10 code.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
If someone had gone to a clinic and been diagnosed, they would.
It's part of everybody's
diagnosed as a smoker.
It's part of everybody's medical history. It's sort of like a standard thing that you put down in every medical record that you want there. Anyway,
but it wouldn't be an ICD-9 code.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
They would have had to retrieve it.
That's my understanding of where they're getting their
because smoking is not a disease.
I don't think they have the full medical record. They've got the claims information. I could be wrong.
Anyway, with all that, I have to say that I came away from this article very much persuaded that the diclofenac risk was probably real, and I agreed with their editorial comments in their discussion where they really said, look, we have many options for treating pain, including other NSAIDs, and there is no demonstrated advantage to diclofenac over ibuprofen, but the risk seems to be higher with diclofenac. So why would you use it? And I think that or naproxen for that matter. What is the benefit here?
Are these big risks? I mean, so Don mentioned that the effect sizes, the relative effect sizes, were in the neighborhood of 20% to 50%, depending on whether you were comparing to nothing or comparing to one of the other active comparators. Don is now showing me his phone that he has looked up the ICD-10 code for smoking.
Out, smoking is a disease after all.
Apologies.
Right. Anyway,
Apologies.
We stand
Don,
corrected.
Don is always correct. Just remember that. So anyway, somewhere between 20 to 50%, depending on what the comparison is. But in absolute terms, are these? I want to know whether we're talking about big risks of heart attacks related to these drugs, or Or are we talking about small risks?
We're not talking about huge risks, but I was curious about this question, and I went back to the Vioxx literature because they actually give some absolute risk data from the Vioxx example, and there the risk. And they were talking about a relative risk there that was quite similar to the relative risks that we're seeing here. It was a little bit larger for Vioxx. It was around 4 or 5, and here we're around 2.
Yeah, but we have the absolute risks here.
Okay, great. So do you want to summarize that? Because I was going to say that in the case of Vioxx, it increased the risk from by around 1 per 100 person years.
1 per 100.
One additional heart attack per 100 person years, which is a lot, actually.
These were a lot. I mean, so with the 30-day event rates here were 0.1% for diclofenac, 0.07% for ibuprofen initiators, 0.13 for, I'm sorry, I'm reading these wrong. 0.1 for diclofenac, 0.07 for ibuprofen, 0.07 for naproxen, and 0.13 for paracetamol.
So a 0.03 difference, right?
0.07 for NSAID.
So that's in a 1 month window. It's we multiply it by approximately 10.
3 per 1,000.
That's 3 per 1,000. And if we do that over
3 per
for 100 patient years, we're getting up around to the same magnitude. So it's
10,000. I shouldn't do public math, but
we're comparable.
We're less than 1%. Not that, I mean, obviously this is cumulative. If you're going to take these over an extended period, you're not just a once-off thing. But I'm just saying these numbers are not massive percentages.
But there is no evidence that diclofenac is
low.
superior to paracetamol for pain relief, nor is it better than ibuprofen, nor is it better than naproxen. So why accept any additional risk unnecessarily? It's not like this is the only solution you have.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Other concerns or things? I mean, I think we're all agreeing that we're in we like this. So Chris mentioned the propensity scores, which Don didn't really talk about. So the other thing they did here was they used this approach called propensity score matching. And propensity scores is an approach to dealing with confounding where we don't think so much about putting variables in a regression model to control the confounding. In the outcome model, we actually think about trying to predict the exposure and fitting a model of the exposure itself, ignoring the outcome. And then we get a predicted probability of that exposure, and we can use that predicted probability as something we can match on to try and balance out the confounding, or we can adjust for it. They didn't do that. They chose to match on it. And it's so striking to me, the reason why people like propensity scores, if you look at table 1, because they had several different comparisons here. So they compared diclofenac to ibuprofen, to naproxen. They compared diclofenac to paracetamol and diclofenac to nothing. And if you look at the diclofenac to paracetamol and diclofenac to NSAIDs, which were the ones where they did the propensity score matching, their table 1 looks like the table 1 you'd see in a randomized trial. You have balance on all of these baseline factors, whereas in the active comparators of diclofenac to ibuprofen and diclofenac to naproxen, they didn't do the propensity score matching, and that's where you see the big differences. So the calendar year shows this big difference in when they're enrolling people, differences in some of the comorbidities, and when you match on this score, this exposure prediction score, it looks like a randomized trial. It's part of why people love it. Now, part of the argument against propensity score is it creates a false sense of confidence that this doesn't balance you on the things that you didn't measure, like in a randomized trial, and so maybe we're getting this sort of false idea of a false confidence, but it does look impressive.
Mm-hmm. So the author made an argument about that, saying that the fact that they were able to match on so many things that they could measure implies that they were probably able to match on things that they couldn't measure. And I was like, really? Is that true? Is that true, Matt? I was surprised to see that asserted.
So I didn't see it quite like that. That's not what I saw them specifically saying. They did a bunch of sensitivity analyses to that would suggest that they actually did control some of the confounding because they did the sort of matching and then not the unmatched, but they sort of including different populations where you would expect the confounding to be greater, and that is what they saw. See if you can find it, Chris, while I'm talking. But I will say this: when you control for something in an analysis, you partly control for anything that it is, that is a cause of that particular
because risk factors party together.
Yeah, and so there probably is some partial control, but it is not the same as controlling for.
What they said specifically, and I'm quoting here, it says the fairly equal distribution of measured covariates among the NSAID groups increased the likelihood that unmeasured variables were also equally distributed. And I think that's what you're saying, that risk factors party together and therefore
Increases the likelihood is not the same as controlled for.
balances it. Because, yeah.
And to me, the critique of the study, I have two mainly, which is number one, which is if there's confounding by indication, it's very hard to remove. Confounding by indication, by which I mean, if you knew during this time that there was, or you suspected during this time that there was a risk for increases in cardiovascular disease, you wouldn't necessarily give these drugs to the people who are at higher risk for cardiovascular disease. But
So
I don't think that's
confounding by indication.
That's what I'm saying.
Yes.
But I don't think that's true here, because if that were the case, then you would actually expect that your comparison groups would be the ones having more heart attacks, not your diclofenac group. Now, maybe we're just downgrading the risk, and the risk is actually higher in the diclofenac groups, and so we're balancing it out. But, it's just curious.
Well, some of their data made me wonder about that because they did this comparison with naproxen, and they found that diclofenac was significantly more likely to cause cardiovascular events than naproxen.
Yep.
And then they did the same comparison with paracetamol, Tylenol.
Yep.
And they found that it was only a little bit more likely, diclofenac was only a little bit more likely than Tylenol to cause cardiovascular disease, which based on the pharmacology of paracetamol, you would think that is completely backwards, because no one has ever said that Tylenol has anything to do with cardiovascular risk.
Yeah.
But the reason that people use Tylenol is very different from the reason that people use naproxen. And they're usually using Tylenol because they're at very high risk of cardiovascular events and want to avoid NSAIDs.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was a little bit of probable bias that was sort of still nested within their data set.
Yeah.
That paracetamol is fundamentally, it tells you something about the patient.
So overall, I think we really liked it. Don, any last comments you want to get in there?
No, the only thing that I was going to note was that in the discussion they compared the event rate that they were able to pull together in comparison to the event rate of some randomized controlled trials, and they had a lot more events, making it this particularly good sort of methodologic approach for events that are not that common, as you guys were describing before.
Yep. So a really nice study, and I hope that we continue to see these emulated trials done more as we go forward. I do want to end with one question for you guys.
So good job, Morton.
Good job. Very good job. And then keep sending those studies to us if people want us to review them. A question for you guys. This study was published in the BMJ. Why in the BMJ, and I think the Lancet might do this too, do they put spaces in between numbers instead of commas?
Mm-hmm. It's a British thing.
Why?
It's a British thing.
1 space 303 space 209 is 1,000,003. I just can't read that.
And they use dots instead of commas.
And they use dots instead of commas. It's a problem. Anyway, moving on.
And they drink warm beer.
And they spell color wrong.
Moving on. All right. So in our second segment, we want to get into a study that was published in Nature Human Behavior, and it was entitled Evaluating the Replicability of Social Science Experiments in Nature and Science Between 2010 and 2015 by Colin F. Kammerer and colleagues. And this paper is a response to the replicability crisis that we've talked about so often on the show before, that has been going on in the psych world, but also in epidemiology as well. And the idea for this study was they actually looked to see whether they could pull out some of these psychological findings that have come out of the journal Nature and Science over this time period, and to see whether or not they could replicate 21 of them. And what they found was they went and replicated these studies. They replicated them as best they could based on their understanding of the studies. They communicated with the authors of the studies to try and make sure that the protocols they were following were accurate representations of what was done in the first instance. What they found, at least as a first cut it, was that about 13 of the 21 studies that they had replicated, at least in their initial
Which means 9
trials.
did not.
Nine did not, and that they found that of the ones that did replicate, many of them replicated, but with smaller effect sizes than were found in the original studies.
And they had a graded approach to that too. They had a first phase and a second phase. If in the first phase, which was smaller, they found an effect in the same direction, they stopped. But in the second phase, if it didn't, then they would go on to the second phase and increase the numbers to increase the power to see if they could find an effect. So it was a sort of a two-tiered approach.
Yeah, this wasn't just sort of a quick and dirty job. I mean, they really...
It's a lot of work.
They gave him many bites of the apple.
Yeah.
In other words, to try to repeat their results.
And so, what do you think about this?
I think it's really fascinating. I thought this comes on the heels of this previous study that was published in Nature, where they looked at 100 articles in the psychology literature and were able only to replicate, I think, 36% of them. So it was worse. But here they're looking specifically at Science and Nature publications, psychology publications, i.e. we are looking at the top tier journals and maybe like the best of the best articles to see whether the issue of reproducibility is even is a significant issue even at the highest ranks. And as you were saying, not only did they fail to replicate almost half of the studies, but of the ones that did replicate, the effect sizes were a lot smaller. Yeah. They were about 3/4 the size as what was originally touted. So there's two sort of, it's like nested Russian dolls worth of bias and misrepresentation in the literature here.
Yeah, I don't know if we're talking about bias specifically here. I mean, I'm not sure, but false positive, I think, is more what's going on here. And so I suppose my question to you guys is, this study's made the rounds and it's been debated back and forth, and it's really concerning when we're finding that about half, I don't know what the number is, but a whole bunch of these studies that were published in these prestigious journals don't actually replicate. Is this a crisis? Or is this just what you'd expect when you use statistical significance as your criteria in a field where we should expect ahead of time that there are so many false positives? Or is it both? Is it a crisis because we should expect that this is what's going to happen?
Or is it a manifestation of this particular kind of research in this particular kind of science? Because behavioral science has got is behavioral behavior really in humans is such a complex process, and to be able to narrow it down and isolate the input and look for an outcome, I think is really difficult in this setting, as opposed to something certainly physics or natural science, but or with respect to other aspects of biology or physiology. I think we know more about all the inputs and all of the factors that are associated with it. And this is a tough area. This is just a really tough area.
So my first thought when I saw this was, so there are 21 studies, and they're going to go and replicate these studies. So I'm envisioning our work. How would you do this?
You'd need a lot of money and a lot of people.
Massive amounts of money, right? So did you? I assume you guys read the 200-page appendix.
No, I'm sorry. I only got to page 140.
I don't know
the rest of it say?
I don't really know if it's 200 pages, but this very long appendix.
I ran out of paper.
Well, the appendix gives the study questions that they were replicating, and you start to understand how they can replicate them. So, for example, just the first one I'll read you a couple of them, but participants that evaluate a resume while using a heavier clipboard will rate the resume as better overall compared to participants that evaluate resume using a lighter clipboard.
What?
No, exactly. So my first thought is that was published in Nature and Science.
Huh.
But obviously we could replicate.
What was the hypothesis in that one?
That the heavier clipboard makes you a
weightier candidate.
I don't know. I have no idea. The probability of maintaining cultural diversity increases with group size. So I don't know how that was actually set up. Priming analytic thinking via images of the thinker increases religious disbelief compared to viewing control images of a visually similar artwork.
Didn't we cover that in one of our wild and wacky sessions?
We may have.
A lot of these seems like a lot of permutations on the Cuddy experiment with power posing. I mean, they all seem kind of cut from the same cloth there.
Yeah, so some of them are not. Hand washing will significantly reduce the need to justify one's choice by increasing the perceived difference between alternatives. You have your people wash their hands before making choices. My point here is twofold. Number one, you can do this because these are things that are easy. And I don't want to misstate this. It's not that they're easy to come up with and design, but you wouldn't need a ton of money to do this, is what I'm saying. And and you probably also don't do these with massive numbers of people, and you can get some undergrad students to do this. Whereas it's very different from what we tend to talk about in epidemiology. My second point is there are a lot of these things that my prior on these, and I'm not a psychologist, so fair enough. My skepticism might be particularly high, but my prior on these would have been, I don't believe this ahead of time. And so if you show me some evidence that suggests that this is happening, that you find an effect, yeah, that's interesting, but it's not going to make me believe it just because you showed it in one study. I'd want more and more data. And I think it reflects a problem with the science. The fact that the replications are based on, the studies are based on, are they statistically significant? We're focused on p-values. And so are the replications, rather than focusing on effect sizes, precisions, and what was our prior to begin with to draw reasonable conclusions, is I think the problem with the science that we have. And of course, sorry to get on my soapbox.
They talk about this. One of the best parts of this article, in fact, was the survey says
it's so good.
The Family Feud data that they put in on figure number 4, where they ask all these people, what do you think? Is it likely to be true or not likely to be true?
Wait. You got to describe this in more detail.
Family Feud is that silly TV show, the game show, where it's not whether you know the right answer,
surveyed, top 4 answers on the board. Here's the question.
Come up with the answer that people think is the right answer, which might not be right, but it's what people think, right? But that is in a way sort of like a Bayesian analysis. It's like, what is the popular wisdom? So here they survey.
I'm not buying that analogy.
Well, they survey these experts in the field, the market research, and they say basically how likely do you think this is to be true? And the ones that fail to replicate all cluster on the left of people would have thought a priori without seeing the data.
This isn't going to replicate.
It can't possibly be true.
Exactly.
So it's like the common sense. It sounds crazy, and indeed the ones that sounded crazy were all the ones that failed to replicate.
Yeah.
It is just like, there you go. So it's I think it was very empowering because it means that your opinion, your reasoned opinion, matters a lot.
This is the Bayesian approach, right? If we start off skeptical and we see some data that shows us something, it's interesting. It should, you prick up your ears, but it doesn't mean you change your mind based on one finding. That could just be the odd finding. You want more information. And that, I think, is the problem here. I thought that the betting markets that they set up, where they let people actually bet on whether or not these things would replicate, is the most fascinating part. And I threw this idea out there on Twitter at one point of, could we do this in epidemiology? And I got a lot of negatives on that, not because I don't think people think it could be done. Just how would we set up a betting market? And replication doesn't work the same in epidemiology, so fair enough. But I still think we could do this, and I think it would be so valuable. Don, any comments you want to add before we?
No, I think you guys pretty much have covered it.
I thought it was a cool study, but I think it highlights more the problems with the field than it does the fact that things just don't replicate.
I think it goes back to what you've said in the past, Chris, that extraordinary findings or extraordinary hypotheses require extraordinarily strong statistics and data to be able to actually make you disbelieve what's common sense.
Yeah, absolutely true.
The other thing I would say is, so they've got this nice figure of the original effect and then the replication effect sort of side by side. And if you look at the confidence intervals around these things, some of the ones that didn't replicate, it's not that they found no effect. They just didn't find an effect that was large enough to be statistically significant with the sample size that they had. Now, that may mean, in fact, there is no effect, and that probably is
But doesn't rule
true.
it out.
But it doesn't rule it out either. And I think that's the problem, is that the focus here is on significance as opposed to estimation.
Yeah. What
What is the effect size? And how precisely did we measure it? And I think that's one of the problems here is this focus on statistical significance is so problematic. It's so dangerous.
I'm totally coming around to your church, man.
I'm so happy.
And I think we just got to this p-value nonsense has just got to stop.
Should we take the I will not use p-values pledge?
I think we should stop using p-values. I think they are
stopped
not helping us. I don't know what would happen next if we did, but the way it is right now is kooky.
It's just not binary, which is what the p-value implicates.
It's a dichotomous disservice.
Well, the p-value doesn't. The comparing it to 0.05 does. But anyway, All right. Well, let's move on to our last segment, which is our amazing and abusing, where we're going to highlight some of the things that make us enjoy our jobs even more than we already do. A look at the weird and wacky things that happen in our field, as well as those things that inspire us or we just really wanted to talk about. Chris, you wanna go first this time?
Yeah, I would love to go first. There's been a lot of talk lately
You got
about
a lot of paper there, Chris.
bee colony collapse.
Is there, or is there
You're not going to read through that entire paper.
No, I'm not.
But hang on, you're going back to the bee well.
I'm going back to the bee well.
He loves the
We
bees.
should be. I love bees.
You like
do.
birds
Go for
too?
it.
Well, the thing is, like, if bees,
You like bees and birds.
all went extinct,
Do you like dogs?
the human race would shortly follow.
Yes.
So bees
The
are in
human
our
race.
best interest.
We're in the midst of an insect collapse. Did you read about that?
I did.
I mean, that's
it's
really scary.
It's really scary. And bees are insects.
I know.
It's
I
like
know.
it goes around. So this was a really interesting paper that gets that. It's called Glyphosate Perturbs the Gut Microbiota of Honeybees, which brings together a lot of my interests in microbiomes and bees all
Okay.
in one.
The bee gut microbiome. I
Right,
like
so
it.
the microbiome. So like, what is people
Wait, they're
often
going to
like,
give bees the poop pill?
they actually
By the way, can I just
They
interrupt
did.
you? Can I interrupt
they
you?
do.
The poop pill episode has gone above 1,000 downloads.
Seriously?
Oh yeah.
That's our
Most downloaded episode.
wow.
Wow,
That says something
that's
about
depressing
our
about
audience.
That really worries me,
And us.
actually.
Go.
Something funny about that.
Sorry.
So there is a popular insecticide called glyphosate, and it is
that Roundup?
It's a weed killer.
Roundup.
I don't know. Is it?
I don't know.
I don't
think
I
it
don't
is.
know. I don't
I don't
think
think it
so.
is because Roundup kills like everything.
Yeah.
This is designed that it only kills some things, and it's the touted advantage of glyphosate as a weed killer is that it targets an enzyme that's found in plants that is not present in animals, including bees. And so it should be non-toxic to insects. And so that's its selling point. But the thing is that bees are more complex than just the bee. The bee has a colony of bacteria living in its intestine. It turns out the intestinal microbiome of the bee is very important to its health. It affects its reproduction, and it affects its ability to resist pathogens. And so what they were curious about is, like, if you treat honeybees with glyphosate, what does that do to their microbiome? And it turns out that it severely perturbs the microbiome of bees in such a way that it eliminates a protective species of bacterium, which is called Snodgrassella, which I think is named after snodgrass, which must be some flowering plant that bees like to eat on.
Okay.
Feed on. You know, I bet it's a source of pollen.
Let's go with that.
Anyway, Snodgrassella. So Snodgrassella is pretty much wiped out by the exposure to glyphosate. And when you then expose the bees whose microbiomes have been sort of perturbed by glyphosate to a pathogen that kills bees, and one of the common bacteria that kills bees is Serratia marcescens. Did you know that, Don?
I did not.
So Serratia is
He didn't even look at me to ask.
it doesn't just cause urinary tract infections in humans. It also kills bees.
Bee killer.
So if you expose a bee to glyphosate, it doesn't seem to have any impact.
Okay.
If you take a bee who has no intestinal microbiota because they have been born and sterile and they have no bacteria in their gut, and you expose it to glyphosate, nothing happens. And if you then transplant a microbiome into the bee and expose it to glyphosate, nothing happens. But if you add Serratia marcescens to this, the bee's survival drops from around 90% at 9 days to around 10% at 9 days.
Wow, that's a big
And
effect.
it basically wipes them out.
Jeez.
And so they're saying that we are fooling ourselves in thinking that this glyphosate is neutral, that it has no impact on the insects, when in fact there is a secondary hit because it's actually wiping out it's perturbing the microbiome of the bee intestines in a way that actually kills the bees indirectly.
So we need to make really small bee poop pills.
Small bee poop pills. Yep. I think, by the way, our crack research team, Leslie, has looked it up, and I think what is it?
Glyphosate?
Is in fact Roundup.
Is it?
I think so. Do we have one version of Roundup?
All right, Leslie, so there we know. So
All
glyphosate
right.
is
So
Roundup.
I was correct twice.
Yeah,
Let it be
in
known.
one episode.
Let it be
So
known.
don't spray it
one
on
episode.
your bees, whatever
Yeah.
you do.
How about the bee's knees?
All right.
You put it on the bee's
All right,
knees.
I'm gonna go second. I'm gonna let Don go last
All
this
right.
time. So mine it comes from a story that goes back to 2007, and I will just go on record right now as saying I believe this is a hoax. I don't believe this is real, but it amused me so much. I
This
thought I
is
would
fake wacky.
I thought I would report it anyway because it just amused me. But this is supposedly a story from the China Daily from 2007 by Li Hongyang. And the title of the article in the newspaper is Lancet Restaurant Gives Medical Professionals Food for Thought. And it says, a barbecue outlet in Beijing has become a favorite dining place for the capital's scientific fraternity. So it goes so on and so forth. Under the rules of the restaurant, scientists, medical professionals, and social scientists are eligible for a discount if they have recently published papers in journals that are included on an internet database such as Science Citation Index and the Social Sciences Citation Index. The paper's impact factor is multiplied by 10 to determine the discount, which can account for as much as 30% of the bill.
Seriously.
I don't believe that's really
No,
true,
that's not possible.
but I find it hilarious.
What about if you're published in one of those predatory journals?
Well, you'd have to go based on the impact factor. I mean, here's a question for you. If you're a predatory journal and yet your impact factor is higher, you're really a predatory journal.
Oh, that's a very philosophical
Yes.
question. Wow. I don't think we can deal with that.
So I don't know the answer to that. But so somebody out there can go out and find out
It's true.
whether this is a true story.
I've just looked it up in Google.
Well,
and
looking
there's
at
a map
Google, but I
for how
got
to
it
get
in
there.
Google. Oh, really?
There's a map for how to get there, and they have a Yelp ready.
But that could be fake too, couldn't it?
It could be, but I don't think it is.
Anyway, whether it's true or not, I don't care because I thought it was amusing.
It's really great.
So that's me. Don, what do you got?
All right, so I just have a very interesting short report that was published in the BBC a while ago, about 3 years ago.
Bees, they're everywhere.
The BBC. Anyway, it's apparently this woman from Britain who her husband very tragically developed Parkinson's disease. And since passed away. But when he first developed the illness, and Parkinson's disease, it's important to understand, is a disease for which we have no firm test to diagnose. It's a disease that's diagnosed by the presence of a constellation of signs and symptoms that a neurologist would elicit from somebody who has Parkinson's disease. And I think many people are familiar with it. But in any event, this woman noticed early on when he was first diagnosed that his smell changed. He smelled differently. And she brought this to the attention of a Parkinson's research group in the United Kingdom. And they thought that they should put it to a test. And what they did is they took 12 individuals who had Parkinson's disease, and they made them wear a T-shirt for a day. They took that T-shirt out, put it into a bag, did the same thing with 12 people that didn't have Parkinson's disease, put it in a bag, and she got 11 out of the 12 correct.
She got them correct.
By smelling the T-shirts. She correctly identified 11 out of the 12. And the most remarkable thing about it, and she said that the 12th she was absolutely sure, but the person claimed to have no symptoms whatsoever. A year later, that person came down with Parkinson's disease.
Wow.
No.
Isn't that amazing?
So what do they think is the mechanism that would explain that there's just some sort of hormonal change or something that's associated with?
I don't think, at least they haven't written a scientific article on it. This was a BBC report,
Okay.
and they didn't really go into what it is, but they are now actively looking at, various biochemical and other sorts of things.
Wow.
Isn't that amazing?
Wow.
I would not have
Stay tuned, I guess, huh?
thought there would be anything like that. Okay. Well, that is the end of our program. If you've got any feedback on this or any other episode, or you want to suggest a study or a topic for us to take on, or you want to send in one of your own papers, we will take that as well. You can tweet us at PopHealthyX, or you can tweet me at ProfMattFox, or Chris at id.gill, or Don at dtheo1. Or you can go find us on the Population Health Exchange website at www.pophealthyx.org. We want to thank Leslie Talalian, Director of Lifelong Learning at the BU School of Public Health, for supporting the podcast and doing research mid-show. And Nick Guler for sound and editing and occasionally getting people to stop doing construction work on different floors of the building.
Leslie, since we're coming up on Halloween, I need to ask, can the undead learn?
Can the undead go to the
Because otherwise
Population
I
Health
feel we're
Exchange website?
discriminating with our website.
I do not know the answer to that.
We should find out.
We'll find out. Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you will download our next episode.